What's up, guys? Nuance Bro checking in, and today we're going to be talking about a new analysis that shows the bias in the media when it comes to suspect descriptions based on race for certain crimes. Actually, this new analysis is about one crime in particular, pretty major one, but if you've seen other works that I've done, for example, my video on Stop Asian Hate, you've seen this theme before, where we see a pattern of media outlets and institutions ignoring the race of suspects if they are minorities, if they are not white, because they have these certain sensibilities and they don't want to perpetuate racism. These are things we hypothesize as the reasons for why they don't include the race, but nevertheless, they do. And stick around because I promise we're going to get into the data, but until now, we really haven't had solid data to demonstrate this. It's always been something that you've noticed if you look and read a lot of articles on these crimes like I do, and I'm sure many of you do. You keep up with it and you notice a pattern over time, but you've never been able to demonstrate it in data. And before we get to the rest of the video, I want to give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor, Ground News. So Ground News is a media aggregating app, and I'm a big fan of it. I've been using it for years. I hope you guys will use it. I have people asking me all the time, where do you find your news? How do you keep updated on the news from day to day? And Ground News is the answer. What I like about it in particular is that it tells you the bias of not just the stories that are being covered, but also the outlets that are covering the stories. You'll see stories that are disproportionately covered by right-wing outlets, left-wing outlets, and Ground News lets you know that. That way, you're better able to mitigate your blind spots, and you're able to see the blind spots of the different political parties. Another feature that I like for those of you who use Twitter is called the Blind Spotter, where you can actually go type in your Twitter username. And if you share a lot of news articles like I do, you can actually see the balance of those news articles that you share. Are you sharing mostly right-wing articles or left-wing articles? As you can see for me, currently most of my news sources lean left. It's about 44% left, 24% fairly neutral, and about 32% right. They've got a web page, they've got an app. I highly encourage you to check it out. Click the link in the description box down below. And now, back to the video. We've seen this phenomena play out in recent tragedies, for example. Like the recent Brooklyn subway shooting you can see in this New York Times article. It's a nearly 2,000-word article, and you can scroll through the entire thing, and nowhere do they mention the race of the suspect. They literally name the suspect, but they do not give a description about his race. They'll call him a gunman. They'll mention that he was wearing an orange construction vest, but again, no mention of race. This phenomena was most egregiously and hilariously demonstrated by popular news YouTuber Philip DeFranco.
As of recording, not a lot is known. As far as the suspect, he's believed to be a male around 5'5" tall with a heavy build, wearing a green construction type vest and a gray hooded sweatshirt.
Did you see that? Did you catch that? Take a look at it again. Because even though you see black right there at the beginning of the description, the editor only highlights male, 5'5" tall, with heavy build. And that's what Phil DeFranco reads. He does not include black in the description. And he continues to read the rest of the description with no race mentioned, even though it's listed on the screen. Now, of course, I noticed this and I posted the clip on Twitter. It got quite a bit of traction with over 2,000 likes and over 90,000 views. And it resulted in a response and explanation from Phil DeFranco, where he says, "This was my mistake. I was recording based on this ABC breaking news report where his race wasn't mentioned, but I forgot to send it to my editor. They ended up pulling up a different tweet later after I left, which accidentally created that weird looking exclusion. My fault though." To which I responded, "I appreciate the response, Phil. At the time ABC put this out, they knew it was a black guy, but they actively decided not to include that description. I'm sure you will update the audience on his black extremist ideology." And we'll get to whether he did that or not in just a bit, but I do want to demonstrate the timing of the description. Like maybe they didn't know it was a black guy at the time and it only came out later. So Phil DeFranco only saw this initial ABC thing that only showed this, and there was no way for him to know whether this was, the race of the suspect. And as you can see here, this is the original ABC tweet he was referring to from ABC News, where it does not list the race of the suspect. We can see here it's posted 11:56 a.m., April 12th, 2022. The only issue is ABC News made a post even before this that had the race of the suspect in it. Here you can see a tweet 11:19 a.m., April 12th, 2022. Breaking, NYPD updates on suspect in Brooklyn subway shooting. Black male, 5'5" tall with heavy build, etc., etc. It's literally the same description, except they added black to the beginning, and this was the first thing they put out before that graphic, which excluded the race. And as someone in news, as someone covering journalism, as someone who knows that there is a suspect on the loose, wouldn't you want to be getting as much information to the audience as possible for a possible identification? This person needs to be ID'd. This person needs to be brought to justice. You're not curious at all? Like maybe, oh, you only saw one graphic. Is that your due diligence that you do? You just see one graphic and you run with that. You don't ask, hey, maybe there's something missing in here. Maybe I should take an extra 2 seconds to see if there's any info out there that I'm missing. Maybe a tweet a few minutes earlier from ABC News that actually includes the race of the suspect. I don't know. I'm not sure if I'm fully trusting this DeFranco explanation. And going back to my response to Phil DeFranco's reply to the video clip of him that I posted, where I said, I'm sure you will update the audience on his black extremist ideology. Well, as you could probably imagine, he didn't exactly do that.
Now, as far as his motive, law enforcement said that this is still under investigation, as are dozens of disturbing, bigoted YouTube videos he posted where he goes on these extended rants expressing very controversial, disgusting views and violence. Right, with those videos having surfaced after he was named as a person of interest, though YouTube has since removed his account. And according to reports, the suspect's videos go back as far as 2016, including some posts where he uses slurs, insults women, and makes racist comments. This, including against black people, specifically blaming black women for violence among black people. In several videos, he discusses death, another one where he talks about a race war and the desire to exterminate specific people. In another, he argues that there need to be more mass shootings, as well as a recent video from Monday where he said that he experienced the desire to kill people but said he didn't want to go to jail. And many of his rants, yes, they focus on current events, but there's a big race angle to a lot of it. There's one, for example, where he's talking about Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson and he expresses how disappointed and seemingly is like crying that she's married to a white man. Another video focused on the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which he said pointed as evidence that white people are genocidal. And then separately, but maybe significant, we also saw him post content criticizing Mayor Adams' recent policies on public safety and homeless outreach on subways, seeming to imply that he himself experienced homelessness and mental health crises.
So yeah, the angle that he went with, the primary focus was to suggest that this man was a racist against black people, black women in particular, or primarily, and the anti-white aspect seemed almost like a side note in his coverage. It was really bizarre because if you actually watch this man's YouTube videos, you watch his unhinged rants. I mean, the guy had multiple videos on his YouTube channel. It was primarily an anti-white message. It was very clearly a black extremist ideology. If you look at the way that Phil DeFranco framed his description of this man's beliefs and motives and racial hatred, it was very bizarre. A recent example on social media that was quite mind-blowing, actually, was when the Sacramento shooter's name was announced. His name was Dondre Martin. Quickly, you saw people posting memes, actually claiming that the shooter was a white guy. These were tweets getting many hundreds of likes, 588 likes here. You had someone saying when they find out Dondre Martin isn't black and they're mad, over 400 likes. You had someone claiming this man on the right here is actually the booking photo for Dondre Smith. This one had almost 300 likes. Another person posting the same picture, claiming this was Dondre Martin with over 100 likes. Another one saying, it's so comical that white people see the name Dondre Martin and quickly assume it's a black person, over 600 likes. But of course, that ultimately wasn't Dondre Martin. In fact, many of them misspelled his name. Indeed, this is Dondre Martin. He is a black male, 26 years old, outstanding warrant in Riverside County for misdemeanor domestic violence. And people had those initial immediate reactions because initially it's hard to find media that will actually confirm the race of the suspect. They will not oftentimes publish booking photos immediately. In many cases, they won't publish them at all. As I've talked about in my previous video, The Real Face of Asian Hate. If you haven't seen that video yet, be sure to take a look at it. And before we get into the data, I just want to bring up one more recent story. This is from the New York Times. Man charged in fatal stabbing of California high school student. Anthony Gray, 52, was charged with murder after the attack on Alicia Reynaga, 15, outside Stagg High School in Stockton, California. And if you read the New York Times article, they mention how old the man is. They mention that he's a man. They mention the name of the man. But nowhere in this article do you see a picture of the suspect. Nowhere do you see a racial description of the suspect. So really, you have no idea. It's not until you actually see the video and photos of the suspect that you realize the race of the suspect. And even in articles like this, where they show videos of the suspect and photos of the suspect, they will not list the race in the article. They will not say black or African American. So when you try to formulate studies based on articles and the language in these articles, like the virulent hate study that I talked about in my other video, The Real Face of Asian Hate, once again, you should absolutely watch it if you haven't watched it. Great video. Your data is going to be flawed. If the media has a bias in how it reports race when it comes to certain crimes, especially the crime of murder, then your data is necessarily going to be flawed. So let's get into the data. So this is from the Washington Free Beacon. The title is, "Yes, the media bury the race of murderers if they're not white." Free Beacon analysis shows how homicide coverage downplays the race of minority offenders. And here you can see they actually have a picture of the New York City subway shooter. And here we can see a little bit on the data collection where it says the Free Beacon collected data on nearly 1,100 articles about homicides from 6 major papers, all written between 2019 and 2021. Those papers included the Chicago Tribune, Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Philadelphia Inquirer, San Francisco Chronicle, and Minneapolis's Star Tribune. For each article, we collected the offender's and victim's name and race and noted where in the article the offender's race was mentioned, if at all. The data suggests an alarming editorial trend in which major papers routinely omit information from news reports, presenting readers with a skewed picture of who does and doesn't commit crime. These editorial choices are part and parcel with the racial reckoning that swept newsrooms in the wake of Floyd's murder, which saw journalists dramatically overhauling crime coverage to emphasize the view that the criminal justice system is racist at the root, perhaps at the expense of honesty about individual offenders' crimes. So here we can see a graph, and the title is, "How far into the article do papers mention a murderer's race?" And on the left side, we see black. On the right side, we see white. And we can see for white people, it's very quick for the papers to mention the offender's race almost immediately if the offender is white. So in the first 10% or 20% of an article, they'll mention that the suspect is white in a majority of cases. Whereas if the offender is black, you can see it's quite the minority in the first 10 to 20% of the article. For a black offender, you have to get through nearly 70% of an article until you see maybe the race of the suspect. The Beacon states, the chart above indicates that papers are far quicker to mention the race of white murderers than black. They also mention how the two races, white and black, account for 92% of mentions in the data. That's why the others aren't shown. Half of articles about a white offender mention his race within the first 15% of the article. In articles about black offenders, by contrast, mentions come overwhelmingly toward the end of the piece. Half of the articles that mention a black offender's race do not do so until at least 60% of the way through, and more than 20% save it until the last fifth of the article. Now again, this is if they mention the race at all. This is only one way by which the media plays this game. Another way is by omitting the race completely, and we can see that here. How often did newspapers mention a murderer's race? Written and imputed offender's race, multi-race incidents omitted. And here we can see for white, it's about 23% of articles mentioned offender's race. For Native Americans, strangely enough, it was 50%, but it looks like they barely had any samples there. Hispanic, only 3%, Black, 6%, and Asian, 5%. So other than Native American, which there's really not that much data for, whites are mentioned way more often in articles than non-whites. Now, the way they did this is they identified the race of the offender in roughly 900 stories where his name, but not his race, was mentioned by looking first at the race of the people with the same name in census data, and then hand confirming race based on mugshots or other images published in local news stories. Here they comment on the data saying, doing so permits an estimate of how often journalists highlight an offender's race or don't. Again, the skew is startling. White offender's race was mentioned in roughly 1 out of every 4 articles, compared with 1 in 17 articles about a black offender and 1 in 33 articles about a Hispanic offender. Another interesting thing to note is also the change witnessed after George Floyd's murder. That's another thing that they took a look at. So after Floyd's murder, did papers change when they mentioned race? So this is the share of articles with race mentioned before/after May 25th, 2020. So here you can see black suspects were mentioned more before George Floyd's murder than after. And whites were mentioned a lot more after George Floyd's murder. Before May of 2020, papers were roughly twice as likely to mention the race of a white, 13% of stories, versus a black perpetrator, 7% of stories. After May of 2020, these numbers were 28% and 4%, a ratio of 7-to-1. Even if you omit some of the more sensationalized stories of Kyle Rittenhouse, Derek Chauvin, and the killers of Ahmaud Arbery, you still get a ratio of about 6-to-1. Here you can see them mention newspapers across the country, including the Inquirer, stopped publishing mugshot galleries in part because 2 Florida newspapers wrote they, quote, may have reinforced negative stereotypes. Others committed to overhauling their language, substituting phrases like formerly incarcerated person for felon to respond to what the Poynter Institute described as an inextricable link between reporting on crime and race and racism. And the Associated Press amended its style guide to discourage the use of the word riot, which allegedly had racist connotations. So there we have it. The patterns that we recognized before are now confirmed by the data. It's there. It is what it is. And I hope a video like this just makes people more aware of how the media frames narratives. Be aware of these things. Pay attention to them. If you're reading an article about a recent crime and they're mentioning the suspect's race, is it towards the beginning? Is it towards the end? Is it mentioned? Is it not mentioned at all? Are they giving a description? What does that description include? These are important things to take notice of, and be aware of the biases of the article. Make sure your perspective is not being skewed from the media that you're consuming. And let me know what you guys think. Did you learn anything from this video? Is this something you already knew, but are you glad that the data is finally backing this up, showing it in clear black and white? Did you enjoy this video? If you did, give it a like. It really helps out the channel. Really appreciate it. And of course, support the sponsor of the video, Ground News, link in the description box down below. And that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Social media links are in the description box below, as well as merch. Support us at nuancebro.com/join, and I'll see you next time, bro.